Hi, Steve Putt here. I have put out a small budget paper that explains some of the main issues that have come out of Tuesday night's budget. At the same time, I just wanted to spend maybe 2 minutes discussing something that I have seen over the last few months that has played a big part in the discussion about the budget, which is debt and deficit. There's been a lot of discussion about debt and deficit. There's been a lot of misinformation, I think, and also maybe a little bit of willful mischief in the answering of some questions about what is debt and what is deficit. They are definitely different things. I think most people understand what debt is. Obviously, it means when you owe someone money. A deficit, on the other hand, is a shortage of revenue compared to expenditure. When it comes to the government, what that means is that they're not raising enough tax revenue to cover their expenses, the expenses in the areas of healthcare, schools, pension payments, New Start payments, etc. Now, one of the words or one of the terms we've heard a fair bit of over the last few months is structural deficit. There are really two types of deficits. One is a cyclical deficit, and that means that depending on the stage in the business cycle, you may have a situation where your expenses are higher than your revenue, but at the other times in the business cycle, your revenues will be greater than your expenses. That's not such a big problem because as the business cycle changes, your situation will change. The GFC would have been a pretty good example of a cyclical deficit, in that at a period of time, expenses had gone up, revenue had dropped, and as a result, there was a potentially short-term deficit. A structural deficit is different. A structural deficit is an underlying imbalance between your expenses and your revenue that is permanent. It is caused by expenses rising at a faster rate than revenue does. People have mentioned quite a bit that Australia's net national debt is pretty small in comparison with other OECD countries, so other Western industrialised democracies, and that comment is absolutely correct. One of the things I have seen is that when people have been asked about the deficit, they responded that our debt's not bad, and while their point is correct, it isn't answering the actual question. So when someone is asking about the deficit and answering that the debt's not bad, it's a bit like saying, hey, how's your income coming along? And you say, yeah, I don't mind having much of a debt on the home loan. When you put it into personal or household terms, it's a bit like saying someone's got $1 million home loan debt, but they've got income of $50,000 more than their expenditure. That's not a bad situation. Whereby if somebody had a $500,000 home loan debt, but their expenses were more than their revenue, and their expenses were expected to continue, that would be a pretty bad situation, clearly. So the idea of a structural debt is very different from the idea of a debt. The idea of our debt's not big, which means we haven't got an issue, is also potentially incorrect if you accept that we have a structural deficit. Now, when it comes to a cyclical deficit, the most reasonable answer there is a little bit of tinkering around the edges, and you wait for the business cycle to get back into good times again. With a structural deficit, you have to change some structures. You have to change some expenditure. You have to change how revenues are collected. So if you give credence to the argument that we have a structural deficit, regardless of our debt level, then what that requires is structural change. That's not an argument for any changes, particularly in the budget. It was just meant to be a couple of minutes, probably 3 or 4 minutes now, on the differences between what is actually debt and what is a structural deficit. So if anyone has any questions about what happened in the budget, hopefully it's answered in the little budget paper I've put out. If anyone has any other questions, then please feel free to let me know. Thanks for that, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.